Every single day, someone somewhere decides they know what's wrong with you. Your boss questions your judgment. Your family critiques your choices. Strangers on the internet dissect your opinions. Friends offer unsolicited advice about your life. The colleague who undermines your ideas in meetings. The partner who points out your flaws. The critic who tears apart your work. In a world where everyone has become a judge, how do we maintain our sense of self-worth without becoming either defensive walls or approval-seeking chameleons? The pain of criticism cuts deeper than physical wounds because it attacks something more vulnerable than our bodies, our sense of identity, competence, and worth. Most people respond to criticism in one of two equally destructive ways. They either build impenetrable armor that keeps out all feedback, including valuable insights, or they become so sensitive to others' opinions that they lose all sense of their own judgment and values. But there exists a third path, one discovered by a man who faced more criticism than perhaps any figure in ancient history. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, advisor to emperors, successful businessman, brilliant writer, and Stoic philosopher, lived his entire adult life in the crosshairs of public scrutiny. Every decision he made was analyzed, every word he spoke was criticized, every action he took was judged by both friends and enemies who watched for any sign of weakness or inconsistency. If you're tired of being controlled by others' opinions and ready to discover how to extract value from criticism while maintaining your psychological independence, subscribe now, because we're about to explore the profound wisdom Seneca developed for handling criticism in ways that strengthen rather than diminish us. These aren't just defensive strategies, they're transformative practices that can turn your harshest critics into your most valuable teachers. Seneca's first and most fundamental insight about criticism was this: the source matters infinitely more than the content. Not all criticism is created equal, and our response should vary dramatically based on who is offering it and why. He wrote, "Every new thing excites the mind, but a sensible person weighs whether it comes from a credible source." This wasn't about dismissing feedback based on whether we like the person giving it. It was about developing the discernment to distinguish between criticism that serves our growth and criticism that serves someone else's agenda. When Seneca faced criticism from the Roman Senate, he didn't respond the same way he responded to feedback from his philosophical mentor. When political enemies attacked his character, he didn't react as he did when trusted friends questioned his decisions. He understood that criticism comes from three primary sources, each requiring a different response: those who want to help us improve, those who want to tear us down, and those who are simply projecting their own internal struggles onto us. The first category, criticism from those who genuinely want to help us grow, represents the most valuable feedback we can receive, even when it's painful. These critics have earned the right to challenge us through their wisdom, their care for our well-being, or their expertise in areas where we're still learning. Seneca taught that we should not just tolerate such criticism but actively seek it out, because it serves our development in ways that praise never can. He wrote to his friend Lucilius, "The willing, destiny guides them. The unwilling, destiny drags them." When we're willing to hear difficult truths from those qualified to offer them, we shape our own development. When we resist such feedback, we force life to teach us the same lessons through harsher circumstances that we might have learned more gently through accepting criticism. The second category, criticism from those who want to diminish us, requires an entirely different response. These critics aren't trying to help us improve. They're trying to make themselves feel better by making us feel worse. They might be motivated by envy, insecurity, anger, or simple malice. Seneca understood that engaging with such criticism as if it were legitimate feedback only serves the critic's agenda while damaging our own peace of mind. For this type of criticism, Seneca advocated what we might call dignified disregard, neither defensive reactions that give critics the emotional response they're seeking nor angry counterattacks that lower us to their level. Instead, we simply refuse to accept criticism from sources that lack either wisdom or good intentions. The third category, criticism from those who are projecting their own issues, represents perhaps the most common form we encounter. These critics aren't necessarily trying to help or harm us. They're unconsciously using us as a screen onto which they project their own fears, insecurities, or unresolved conflicts. The perfectionist who criticizes others for being sloppy. The procrastinator who attacks others for being overly ambitious. The people pleaser who condemns others for being selfish when they set healthy boundaries. Seneca taught that recognizing projection protects us from taking personally criticism that isn't actually about us. When someone's criticism reveals more about their own struggles than about our actual behavior, we can respond with compassion rather than defensiveness, understanding rather than anger. The practice of source analysis begins with asking ourselves specific questions when criticism arrives. Who is offering this feedback? What qualifies them to judge this aspect of my life or work? What might motivate them to criticize me in this way? What patterns do I notice in the types of criticism they typically offer? Am I the only person they criticize in this manner, or is this part of a broader pattern in how they interact with others? These questions don't automatically invalidate criticism from flawed sources. Even broken clocks are right twice a day, but they help us calibrate our response appropriately. We might extract useful information from criticism offered by someone with poor motives while refusing to accept their broader judgment about our worth or competence. Seneca's second revolutionary insight was that criticism often reveals the critic's values more clearly than it reveals our flaws. When someone criticizes us, they're not just commenting on our behavior. They're revealing what they consider important, what they fear, what they value, and what they believe should be prioritized. This revelation can be incredibly useful information, even when the criticism itself is off target. Consider how different critics focus on different aspects of the same behavior. The risk-averse person criticizes our recklessness when we pursue ambitious goals. The ambitious person criticizes our complacency when we prioritize stability. The extrovert criticizes our antisocial behavior when we choose solitude. The introvert criticizes our attention-seeking when we enjoy social interaction. Each criticism reveals the critic's worldview more than it reveals objective truth about our choices. Understanding this dynamic protects us from the exhausting attempt to satisfy everyone's expectations. When we recognize that criticism often reflects the critic's perspective rather than universal truth, we can appreciate diverse viewpoints without feeling obligated to conform to all of them. We can learn from various perspectives while maintaining our own judgment about what choices serve our values and circumstances. This insight also helps us understand why the same behavior that one person criticizes, another person might praise. The dedication that one person calls workaholism, another calls commitment. The caution that one person calls wisdom, another calls cowardice. The independence that one person calls strength, another calls selfishness. These contradictions aren't confusing when we understand that critics are revealing their own values through their judgments. Seneca's third foundational principle was the practice of extracting wisdom from criticism regardless of its source or motivation. Even unfair, malicious, or completely inaccurate criticism can serve our development if we approach it with the right mindset. He wrote, "Every change of fortune affects either our person or our possessions. A wise man is prepared for either." In the context of criticism, this means being prepared to benefit from feedback regardless of whether it's delivered with kindness or cruelty. This practice requires what we might call psychological alchemy, the ability to transform base criticism into golden insight. Even when criticism is 90% wrong, we can focus on the 10% that might contain useful information. Even when criticism is motivated by malice, we can use it to understand how others perceive us. Even when criticism is completely unfair, we can use it to practice responding with grace under pressure. The psychological alchemy doesn't mean accepting false criticism as true or pretending that all feedback is equally valuable. It means maintaining enough emotional stability to separate potentially useful information from the emotional packaging in which it's delivered. It means being strong enough to learn from enemies as well as friends, to grow from attacks as well as support. Do you find yourself avoiding situations where you might face criticism, or exhausting yourself trying to prevent others from finding fault with your choices? Seneca's approach offers a third alternative, engaging with criticism as a philosopher rather than as a victim or a warrior. Seneca's fourth profound insight revolutionizes how we understand the relationship between criticism and our sense of self-worth. He realized that our emotional reaction to criticism reveals more about our own insecurities than it reveals about the validity of the criticism itself. When criticism devastates us, it's often because it touches on doubts we already harbor about ourselves. When criticism bounces off us completely, it's often because we're confident in that particular area of our lives. This principle, which we might call criticism as self-diagnosis, transforms every critical comment into an opportunity for self-discovery. Instead of asking, "Is this criticism true or false?" we can ask, "What does my reaction to this criticism tell me about my own relationship with this aspect of myself?" The criticism that triggers our strongest emotional responses often points toward areas where we need to develop greater self-knowledge, self-acceptance, or actual skills. When someone criticizes our work and we feel devastated, it might indicate that we're more attached to external validation than we realized. When someone questions our judgment and we become furious, it might reveal that we're less confident in our decision-making abilities than we pretend. When someone comments on our appearance and we feel crushed, it might expose insecurities we've been avoiding rather than addressing. Seneca practiced this self-diagnostic approach throughout his life, using criticism as a mirror to examine his own character and motivations. He wrote, "The best cure for anger is delay," recognizing that the immediate emotional reaction to criticism often clouds our ability to extract its potential value. By creating space between receiving criticism and responding to it, we gain access to insights that aren't available when we're operating purely from emotional reactivity. This practice doesn't mean that all criticism is valid or that we should accept every negative comment as truth. It means using our emotional reactions as information about ourselves while maintaining our own judgment about the accuracy and usefulness of the feedback. The goal isn't to become emotionally numb to criticism, but to become emotionally intelligent about what our reactions teach us. The self-diagnostic approach also protects us from the trap of defensive perfection, the exhausting attempt to become so flawless that no one can find anything to criticize. Seneca understood that such perfection is impossible and that pursuing it often leads to paralysis rather than improvement. Instead of trying to eliminate all basis for criticism, we can focus on developing the wisdom to learn from criticism and the strength to disregard criticism that doesn't serve our growth. Seneca's fifth transformative principle was the practice of criticism preemption, anticipating likely criticisms and preparing thoughtful responses before they arrive. This wasn't about becoming defensive or argumentative, but about developing clarity about our choices so that we could engage with criticism from a position of self-knowledge rather than self-doubt. Before making important decisions, Seneca would imagine how various people might criticize those decisions and consider whether those criticisms revealed genuine problems with his thinking or simply reflected different values and priorities. This practice helped him make more thoughtful choices while also preparing him to respond to criticism with wisdom rather than reaction. The preemption practice involves asking ourselves questions like, what aspects of this decision are most likely to be criticized? What legitimate concerns might others have about my approach? What values or priorities might lead someone to see this choice differently? How would I explain my reasoning to someone who disagrees with my decision? What would I need to know to change my mind about this choice? This internal dialogue doesn't guarantee that our decisions are correct, but it ensures that they're thoughtful. When criticism arrives, we're prepared to engage with it constructively rather than reactively. We can acknowledge valid concerns while standing firm in our reasoning. We can appreciate different perspectives while maintaining our own judgment. The preemption practice also reveals when our decisions are based more on impulse, ego, or fear than on careful consideration. If we can't imagine any reasonable criticism of our choices, we might not have thought them through carefully enough. If we can't explain our reasoning to ourselves, we probably can't explain it effectively to others. If we can't acknowledge any potential problems with our approach, we might be operating from defensiveness rather than wisdom. Seneca's sixth principle addresses perhaps the most challenging aspect of handling criticism: maintaining our commitment to our values and goals when others question them. He understood that living according to philosophical principles often puts us at odds with conventional wisdom and social expectations. The person who chooses voluntary simplicity will be criticized for wasting their earning potential. The person who prioritizes relationships over career advancement will be questioned about their lack of ambition. The person who refuses to compromise their integrity will be called naive or impractical. For such criticism, Seneca developed what we might call values-based immunity, the ability to receive criticism without allowing it to shake our fundamental commitments. This immunity doesn't come from stubbornness or closed-mindedness, but from deep clarity about why we've chosen our particular path and what we're willing to sacrifice to stay on it. Values-based immunity requires us to distinguish between criticism of our methods and criticism of our fundamental principles. We can remain open to feedback about how we pursue our goals while staying committed to the goals themselves. We can adapt our strategies while maintaining our direction. We can improve our execution while defending our vision. This distinction is crucial because it allows us to learn from criticism without being paralyzed by it. When someone criticizes our approach to building a business, we can consider whether their feedback might help us be more effective. When someone criticizes our decision to start a business at all, we can appreciate their concern while remaining committed to our entrepreneurial path. Values-based immunity also protects us from the criticism that comes from living differently than others expect. When our choices challenge other people's assumptions about how life should be lived, we often face criticism that's really about their discomfort with our different approach rather than about any genuine problems with our choices. Seneca wrote extensively about this dynamic because his philosophical lifestyle often drew criticism from those who couldn't understand why a wealthy, influential person would choose to study wisdom, practice voluntary poverty, and prioritize character development over social advancement. He learned to distinguish between criticism that could help him live his values more effectively and criticism that simply reflected others' inability to understand or appreciate those values. The seventh principle that Seneca developed was the practice of criticism transformation, actively using critical feedback as raw material for our own development, regardless of the spirit in which it was offered. This goes beyond simply extracting useful information from criticism. It involves using the experience of being criticized to develop qualities like patience, humility, emotional resilience, and compassion. When someone criticizes us harshly, we can use that experience to practice remaining calm under pressure. When someone offers feedback in a condescending manner, we can use that opportunity to develop humility about our own tendency to judge others. When someone attacks our character unfairly, we can use that moment to strengthen our commitment to responding with grace rather than retaliation. This transformation practice turns every critic into an unwitting teacher, every attack into an opportunity for growth, and every uncomfortable feedback session into a training ground for wisdom. The critic who challenges our ideas forces us to think more clearly. The critic who questions our motives forces us to examine our intentions more honestly. The critic who attacks our character forces us to define and demonstrate our values more precisely. Seneca understood that this transformation requires a fundamental shift in how we view criticism, from something that happens to us to something we can use for our benefit. Instead of being passive recipients of others' judgments, we become active agents who extract value from every interaction, regardless of the other person's intentions. This doesn't mean becoming grateful for all criticism or pretending that unfair attacks are gifts. It means developing the psychological strength to benefit from experiences we didn't choose and couldn't prevent. It means finding ways to grow from encounters that others intended to diminish us. Why do some people seem unshakable when criticized while others are devastated by the slightest negative comment? Seneca's principles reveal that the difference lies not in the criticism they receive but in how they choose to relate to that criticism. The transformation that occurs when we consistently apply Seneca's principles is profound. Criticism stops being something we fear and starts being something we can use. We develop what might be called criticism immunity, not the inability to hear feedback, but the ability to process it without being controlled by it. This immunity comes from understanding that other people's opinions, even when delivered with authority or certainty, are just opinions, and that our response to those opinions is entirely within our control. Seneca's eighth insight deals with one of the most challenging aspects of criticism, the criticism that contains truth mixed with malice. Often the most difficult feedback to handle isn't completely false criticism that we can easily dismiss, but criticism that identifies real areas for improvement while being delivered in a spirit of attack rather than assistance. The colleague who points out genuine flaws in our work but does so to embarrass us publicly. The family member who identifies real issues in our behavior but uses them as weapons during arguments. The critic who notices actual problems but exaggerates them beyond proportion. For such criticism, Seneca developed the practice of surgical extraction, carefully removing the useful information while leaving behind the poison. This requires emotional surgery of the highest order, the ability to separate content from context, information from intention, and wisdom from weaponization. We acknowledge the valid points while refusing to accept the hostile spirit in which they're offered. This surgical approach involves asking ourselves specific questions. If this same information had been offered by someone who cared about my well-being, how would I receive it? What would I need to change if the factual content is accurate, regardless of the critic's motives? How can I use this information for my growth while protecting myself from the critic's attempt to harm me? The practice protects us from two equally destructive responses: dismissing valuable feedback because of its hostile packaging, or accepting unnecessary shame and self-doubt along with legitimate insights. We can admit our mistakes without accepting that we're worthless. We can acknowledge our areas for improvement without believing that we're fundamentally flawed. We can learn from criticism without being diminished by it. Seneca also understood that this surgical extraction becomes easier with practice. As we develop skill at separating information from emotion, content from context, we become less vulnerable to manipulative criticism while becoming more responsive to helpful feedback. We learn to receive the gift while refusing the poison that might be wrapped around it. The ninth principle addresses the criticism that comes not from malice but from genuine misunderstanding. Often people criticize us because they don't understand our circumstances, our values, our constraints, or our long-term vision. The single person who can't understand why we won't work late every night. The wealthy person who can't understand why we're careful with money. The risk-averse person who can't understand why we pursue uncertain opportunities. For such criticism, Seneca advocated the practice of compassionate education, responding to misunderstanding with patience and clarity rather than defensiveness or anger. This involves recognizing that the critic isn't trying to harm us but is genuinely confused about our choices, and that their confusion might be resolved through explanation rather than argument. The compassionate education approach requires us to ask ourselves, does this person have enough information to understand my choice? Have I explained my reasoning clearly? Are there aspects of my situation that aren't obvious to outsiders? Would I make the same criticism if I were in their position with their information? Sometimes this practice reveals that the criticism is based on incomplete information that we can provide. Sometimes it reveals that the critic's values are so different from ours that understanding is impossible, but that their criticism comes from care rather than malice. Sometimes it reveals that we haven't been clear enough about our reasoning, even to ourselves. This principle doesn't mean that we owe everyone explanations for our choices, but it helps us distinguish between criticism that comes from hostility and criticism that comes from confusion. When we respond to misunderstanding with education rather than defensiveness, we often turn critics into allies and create opportunities for deeper connection and mutual respect. Seneca's 10th principle is perhaps his most sophisticated: the recognition that some criticism is actually a form of projection, where critics are unconsciously criticizing in us what they dislike or fear in themselves. The person who criticizes others for being too emotional might be uncomfortable with their own feelings. The person who attacks others for being selfish might struggle with setting healthy boundaries. The person who condemns others for being unrealistic might have given up on their own dreams. Understanding projection doesn't invalidate all criticism, but it helps us respond with wisdom rather than reactivity. When someone's criticism seems disproportionately intense or focuses on issues that aren't central to the situation at hand, projection might be involved. When criticism reveals more about the critic's fears and insecurities than about our actual behavior, we can respond with compassion rather than defensiveness. The projection principle also helps us avoid taking personally criticism that isn't really about us. When someone uses us as a screen onto which they project their own unresolved issues, our defensive responses often intensify their projection rather than resolving the underlying dynamic. By recognizing projection and responding with understanding rather than argument, we can sometimes help critics see their own patterns while protecting ourselves from unnecessary emotional damage. Seneca wrote, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." This wisdom applies equally to criticism. When we pause before responding to criticism, we often gain access to insights about what's really happening in the interaction. We might realize that the critic is struggling with their own issues, that they're operating from incomplete information, or that they're genuinely trying to help us despite their clumsy delivery. The pause also allows us to choose our response rather than simply react. We can decide whether this criticism deserves a detailed response, a brief acknowledgement, or complete disregard. We can determine whether the critic has earned the right to detailed explanations or whether our energy would be better invested elsewhere. Seneca's 11th principle recognizes that mastering criticism is ultimately about developing what he called inner citadel, a core sense of self-worth and direction that remains stable regardless of external opinions. This citadel isn't built through isolation from feedback but through selective integration of wisdom while maintaining independence from others' judgments about our fundamental worth. The inner citadel allows us to receive criticism without being devastated by it and to receive praise without being inflated by it. We can appreciate both forms of feedback as information while maintaining our own judgment about our character, competence, and choices. We become neither defensive nor approval-seeking, but simply responsive to wisdom regardless of its source. Building this citadel requires ongoing practice in distinguishing between our essential self and our roles, achievements, mistakes, or current circumstances. We are not our job performance, our relationship status, our financial situation, or our latest mistake. We are the consciousness that observes these changing circumstances and the character that chooses how to respond to them. This distinction doesn't make us indifferent to our performance or circumstances, but it prevents those things from determining our fundamental sense of worth. We can work to improve our skills without believing that we are our skills. We can strive for success without believing that we are our achievements. We can learn from our mistakes without believing that we are our failures. Have you noticed how the people who handle criticism most gracefully are often those who seem most secure in themselves? Seneca's principles reveal that this security comes not from perfection or from avoiding criticism, but from developing a philosophical relationship with feedback that serves growth rather than ego. The ultimate mastery of criticism, as Seneca understood it, isn't about becoming invulnerable to others' opinions. That would be neither possible nor wise. Instead, it's about developing what we might call response sovereignty, the ability to choose how we engage with criticism based on our own judgment rather than being controlled by our emotional reactions or social pressures to respond in particular ways. This sovereignty manifests in several practical abilities that Seneca cultivated throughout his life. First, the ability to receive criticism without immediately defending ourselves, which creates space for actually hearing what's being said rather than simply preparing our counter-argument. Second, the ability to acknowledge valid points in criticism without accepting invalid judgments about our overall worth or character. Third, the ability to learn from enemies as readily as from friends, extracting wisdom regardless of the critic's intentions or attitudes toward us. Perhaps most importantly, response sovereignty includes the ability to choose when not to respond to criticism at all. Seneca understood that not every critical comment deserves a response, and that our attention and energy are finite resources that should be invested wisely. Some criticism comes from sources so lacking in wisdom or good intention that engaging with it only validates the critic's importance while depleting our own peace of mind. The practice of choosing when to respond involves asking ourselves several key questions. Will responding to this criticism serve my growth or the growth of others? Does this critic have the wisdom, information, or good intention necessary to offer valuable feedback? Am I responding from a desire to learn and improve, or from a need to defend my ego? Would my time and energy be better invested in other pursuits? These questions help us distinguish between criticism that deserves thoughtful engagement and criticism that deserves dignified disregard. The goal isn't to become dismissive of all feedback, but to become selective about which feedback we choose to engage with deeply. This selectivity protects our mental resources while ensuring that we remain open to genuinely helpful insights. Seneca also developed sophisticated strategies for responding when engagement is appropriate. He understood that the manner of our response often determines whether criticism becomes a productive dialogue or a destructive argument. When responding to valid criticism, he advocated for what we might call graceful acknowledgement, accepting the feedback without unnecessary self-flagellation or defensive excuses. This graceful acknowledgement might sound like, "You're right, I did handle that situation poorly. Thank you for pointing it out. I'll think about how to approach similar situations differently in the future." Such responses demonstrate strength rather than weakness, wisdom rather than defensiveness, and confidence rather than insecurity. They also encourage critics to offer more helpful feedback in the future rather than feeling the need to attack more forcefully to get their point across. When criticism is partially valid but delivered poorly, Seneca advocated for what we might call selective acknowledgement, accepting the useful parts while neither confirming nor arguing with the problematic aspects. This might sound like, "I appreciate you pointing out that my presentation lacked specific examples. That's helpful feedback I can use for next time." This response acknowledges the valid criticism without engaging with any personal attacks or unfair characterizations that might have accompanied it. For criticism that's completely invalid or malicious, Seneca often advocated for what we might call dignified non-engagement, neither defending ourselves nor attacking the critic, but simply declining to participate in the interaction. This might involve changing the subject, ending the conversation politely, or simply not responding at all. The key is maintaining our own dignity while refusing to be drawn into unproductive conflict. The mastery of response also includes the ability to set boundaries around criticism without becoming defensive about those boundaries. We can establish that certain topics are not open for discussion, that certain times or places are inappropriate for critical feedback, or that certain delivery methods are unacceptable to us. These boundaries aren't about avoiding all criticism, but about creating conditions where criticism can be productive rather than destructive. For example, we might say, "I'm open to feedback about my work, but I need it to be specific and delivered privately rather than in front of the whole team." Or, "I appreciate your concern about my choices, but I've made this decision carefully and I'm not looking for advice about it right now." Such boundaries demonstrate self-respect while indicating our willingness to engage with criticism under appropriate circumstances. Seneca understood that mastering criticism is ultimately about developing what the Stoics called preferred indifference, the ability to prefer certain outcomes while not being emotionally dependent on achieving them. We can prefer to be respected rather than criticized, understood rather than misunderstood, appreciated rather than attacked, while accepting that we don't control others' responses to us. This preference without dependence allows us to work toward being worthy of respect while accepting that some people might not respect us regardless of our worthiness. We can strive to be clear in our communication while accepting that some people might misunderstand us despite our clarity. We can aim to be helpful and kind while accepting that some people might criticize us even for our virtues. The practice of preferred indifference protects us from the exhausting attempt to manage others' opinions through our behavior. When we accept that criticism is sometimes inevitable regardless of how well we perform, we can focus on performing well for its own sake rather than as a strategy for avoiding criticism. When we understand that some people will criticize us no matter what we do, we can make choices based on our values rather than on our predictions about others' responses. This freedom from opinion management often paradoxically results in less criticism, because people tend to respect those who seem secure in themselves and unmoved by social pressure. When we stop trying desperately to avoid criticism, we often become less vulnerable to it. When we stop seeking universal approval, we often become more genuinely likable. Seneca's final insight about criticism was perhaps his most profound, that learning to handle criticism skillfully prepares us for all of life's other challenges. The person who can receive feedback without being devastated develops emotional resilience that serves them in every area of life. The person who can extract wisdom from hostile sources develops adaptability that helps them learn from any situation. The person who can maintain their values despite social pressure develops integrity that guides them through moral complexity. The skills we develop in handling criticism, emotional regulation, perspective taking, boundary setting, wisdom extraction, and response choice are the same skills that help us navigate relationship conflicts, workplace challenges, financial pressures, health issues, and every other form of adversity. Criticism becomes a training ground for life mastery, a gymnasium where we develop the psychological muscles that serve us in countless other situations. Perhaps most importantly, mastering criticism teaches us something essential about human nature: that everyone, including ourselves, is struggling to understand how to live well, and that criticism often reveals this struggle more than it reveals clear answers about how we should behave. When we understand that critics are often as confused and uncertain as we are, we can respond to their criticism with compassion rather than defensiveness, wisdom rather than anger. This understanding doesn't make all criticism valid or all critics wise, but it helps us maintain our humanity in the face of judgment. We can disagree with criticism without demonizing critics. We can protect ourselves from unfair attacks without attacking in return. We can maintain our boundaries while remaining open to growth. As we conclude this exploration of Seneca's wisdom about handling criticism, remember that mastering these skills is a lifelong practice rather than a one-time achievement. Every critical comment offers an opportunity to practice these principles, to strengthen our response sovereignty, and to deepen our understanding of both ourselves and others. The goal isn't to become indifferent to others' opinions. That would eliminate valuable sources of feedback and connection. The goal is to become sovereign in our responses to those opinions, able to receive wisdom regardless of its packaging while maintaining our own judgment about our worth, our choices, and our direction. Start practicing these principles with small criticisms before applying them to major attacks. Notice your emotional reactions to feedback and use those reactions as information about your own growth areas. Practice the pause between receiving criticism and responding to it. Experiment with extracting wisdom from unlikely sources. Develop your own criteria for determining which criticism deserves your attention and which deserves your disregard. If these insights have helped you develop a healthier relationship with criticism, subscribe to our channel for more wisdom about navigating human relationships with ancient philosophical principles. Share this video with someone who struggles with criticism or who offers criticism to others. And remember, every critic is an opportunity to practice wisdom, every attack is a chance to demonstrate strength, and every moment of feedback is a possibility for growth. If we have the skills to respond with philosophical grace rather than emotional reactivity. Seneca faced criticism that few of us will ever encounter, political attacks that threatened his life, philosophical challenges that questioned his deepest beliefs, personal attacks that targeted his character and motives. His wisdom about handling criticism emerged from real-world testing under the most difficult circumstances. The principles we've explored aren't just theoretical concepts but practical tools that have been proven effective by someone who faced the ultimate tests of grace under pressure.